Hail and well met Slayers of Giants. Welcome to Chapter 18 of my serial novel, Tilting at Windmills. Remember, this is a draft. There will be lots of changes I'll be making to the final manuscript based on feedback from readers who posted in the comments on Substack and Patreon. If you notice anything, from the smallest typo to the largest structural change, I'll be very grateful for your notes. So become a patron of my Patreon or subscribe to my Substack so you'll get a little reminder each week when a new chapter comes out. And if you know someone who might enjoy this show, tell them to go back and catch up with you. Here's Tilting at Windmills, Chapter 18. A wedding crashed and souls unsettled. Even before the sun sunk down over the horizon line on the Pacific, darkness crept into the shadows on the west side of the mountains, and once Serge and Rolando drove into these shadows, night fell quickly. Serge's car was old enough he had to turn the lights on manually, and he always felt a twinge of anxiety that he would accidentally blind oncoming traffic with his high beams. Because his lights didn't automatically adjust to the growing gloom, some cars mistook his standard nighttime lights for his highs and flashed him in warning or spite, making him second guess. Rolando, trusting in his chauffeur to navigate the propriety of illumination and the curvy roads wending their way up and down through the mountains, continued the story of Poe while the Raven itself stood between the men on the center console, the Raven's faint glow now visible to Serge out of the corner of his eye, similar in strength to his console and radio display, but coming from his elbow.
Poe here was very eager to get to Bangkok to interrupt the wedding of Flieng and his new Thai bride, and I could see no reason to delay. So we hired a local tuk-tuk driver to carry us to the city, then took a train across the border. Poe had been my squire for some years at this time, so this must have been, 1926 or 1927?
The Raven nodded in a very human way.
Yes, Rolando continued, meaning Poe was 26 or 27 years old. Age had calmed him a bit, but on this journey he was so furious at Tara's husband, Flieng. His knee bounced, his jaw was set, and he shoved his eyebrows down as though he could make the train go faster by giving himself a headache. I did not point out to him that some of his own dalliances with women on our adventures risked placing his sexual conquest in exactly the same position as Tara, and for all we knew had done so to one or two after our departure. He shrugged. Perhaps he recognized his own hypocrisy, and channeled some of his anger at himself toward Flieng. And perhaps this same anger kept him from speaking to Tara much during the journey. He had learned to woo women with a high degree of efficiency, especially since we were frequently on the move. But Poe hadn't learned much about comforting someone, still believing his acts to avenge wrongs done to them would serve as the best comfort he could provide. I was 41 years old at the time, not yet stretching my lifespan by magical means. I hope I have acquired additional wisdom and patience in the intervening century, but even by that age, I'd learned revenge and justice are no the same thing.
When Rolando wanted to make sure Serge understood something was important, the T in the word not disappeared completely, a kind of verbal finger wag.
So Poe spent the whole trip, what is it called, when smoke is rising from the head?
Fuming, Serge supplied.
Yes, he was fuming, which left me to speak with Tara and attempt to provide her some comfort other than the promise of vengeance. In my conversations with her, I learned she did not trust Flieng to treat her well if he were to return to her. She suspected he would leave her again as soon as we had left, or he would beat her. She had believed her marriage to be a fairy tale story about a girl from the factory floor, a peasant, who won the heart of the prince who owned the castle, that they would live happily ever after. Now she feared it would become one of those Grimm's brothers kind, which are horror stories told to children, a tale in which the girl is tricked into moving into the castle, and she is trapped there, and the prince is also trapped there, and they just torment one another forever. I said this sounded more like a play by Sartre, but she had not read No Exit, so I told her the story on the train ride. When I finished, she declared that would be a terrible night at the theater, and she couldn't understand why anyone would pay money to see such a thing. People like to feel someone understands their circumstances, I said. And a night out at the theater is a night of escape from the castle, no? I suspect if you and Flieng ended up in such a situation you predict, you would very much like to leave home for the evening and see such a play. She smiled sadly and nodded. There must be many people who feel the same way if they can fill theaters with audiences who want to sit and watch three people trapped in hell making one another miserable forever. It was my turn to smile, though the sadness of mine was sympathy aimed at Tara. Luckily, it is not a popular play. Your situation is unusual, it seems, and we will endeavor to rescue you from it, though I am hopeful we can find a better way than Poe's. When we arrived in Bangkok, we did not even have time to find an inn to stay for the night. We asked around about the date and location of the wedding of Liang and his new bride. It turned out we were just in time. The wedding would take place that very night. People did not know Liang, but it turned out his business partner had quite a reputation, both for his ruthlessness and his success in business. His name was Somchai Sawanarat. Kun Sawanarat's daughter was named Gamon.
He pronounced it properly as Gamon.
It means serene, and she was something of a celebrity because of her beauty, her wealth, and her reputation for being quiet and demure. Many a young man dreamed of marrying her, less as a mate and more as a winning lottery ticket. The fact that she was going to marry a foreign businessman disappointed the hotel clerks and tuk-tuk drivers we spoke with, but once we knew to ask about the Sawanarat wedding, they easily pointed us there. Everyone was curious to see this groom and find out why Kun Sawanarat believed him worthy of his daughter. When we arrived at the luxury hotel where the wedding would be held, the lobby was filled with reporters and gossip columnists. A reporter took one look at Tara and shouted, You are Cambodian. Are you a member of the groom's party? Tell us your name and relationship to Liang. What can you tell us about him?" Tara had never been attacked with questions in this way before, and she froze. We were not properly dressed for a wedding. Though she'd changed out of her patched rags and her family had combed the leaves out of her long hair, she wore the clothing they'd given her in her village. Poe and I wore our usual adventuring attire, and no one could see my magical armor. When photographers' flashbulbs began their bombardment of photons, Tara shrank back as though she could feel each burst. Instinctively, Poe stepped in front of her, and reporters began shouting questions at him. They couldn't identify his nationality by sight, but they guessed he was European, and wanted to know his relationship to this new Cambodian woman, and their connection to the groom. I'd cast my daily translation spell on all three of us surreptitiously, so Poe understood the reporter's questions. Tara did too, but she didn't know why she was understanding this foreign language, and that scared her even more. I stepped in front of the frightened Tara and the angry defensive Poe. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, in passable Thai, "I am Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona. I am a family friend of the groom, Liang, and I have traveled all the way around the world to attend his wedding. But this will be a surprise to him, so we are not on the guest list. If one of you can direct me to the groom, I will be most grateful, and I pledge to provide you with a complete interview after the ceremony."
Rolando inclined his head toward Serge.
"Access journalism. It is a manipulation, and thus not a particularly honorable tactic, but it is often how the game is played. Ask a politician or a celebrity. In a battle for attention, good reporters do not want to be captured, but they will suffer it in order to get a story. And in the battle for hearts and minds, subjects do not like to give access, but they will in order to avoid bad press. It is all inevitable and seedy. Regardless, it worked. Hands shot up in the air, and I selected an eager reporter who directed us to the security guards, then the wedding planner. She had no idea where to plug us into the seating, so though she didn't want to bother the groom, she had someone send a message of our arrival, and he came out to meet us. His soon-to-be father-in-law also noticed our arrival and wanted to learn about this foreign noble, who he'd soon be connected with by marriage. As they made their way over to me, Mr. Sawanarat's daughter peeked into the room, trying to see what was going on. And that was when Poe saw Gaman Sawanarat for the first time. Now, I am a knight-errant, a profession which, as I have previously explained, is the very origin of romantic love, so you probably presume I believe in love at first sight. But you must understand, I am also a warrior mage, and as such I am well aware of the existence of enchantment. Love, real love, is a feeling, yes, but it is also a commitment, and it takes time to foster the necessary feeling to maintain that commitment when times are difficult. But enchantment, that can be instantaneous. Yes, it can be a malicious spell cast by an enemy, forcing one to feel a strong attraction towards someone the victim wouldn't normally choose, but the enchantment can also be, I don't know, cosmic perhaps? Fate? Where does magic end and simple biology and chemistry and physics take over? Are these forces, the gravity which pulls mass together, electrons spinning around atoms to cause magnetism, evolution pushing us toward partners to preserve the species, are these things not magical as well in their own ways? Po was not compelled by any magical spell. I know this because I saw how quickly he became enchanted by Gaman Sawanarat, and I thought she might be a witch. She certainly looked the part of an enchantress of some kind. I don't know if you've ever seen traditional Thai bridal wear, but Gaman, the daughter of such a wealthy man, wore a borofiman, a kind of dress fitting for royalty. Hers consisted of a long tube skirt and a blouse with a high neck covered in brocade, which revealed the lower-cut sleeveless blouse underneath. The blouse and skirt were off-white, but the brocade and the decorative strip of silk hanging down over the center of the skirt were a stunning opalescent white. Her long hair was pulled back and then pinned with a kind of tiara, which sat behind her head in front of the braids tied into a decorative knot there. It was easy to imagine her creating such a hairdo with a wand rather than the multiple hairdressers who must have been involved. Her makeup had some of the same pearl rainbow-inducing coloring as the bright white portions of the dress, and as she came into the room's bright light, she shimmered. Po walked across the room with a confidence I'd rarely seen in the young man, like he had every right to approach the bride at a wedding he was crashing and speak directly to her. "Miss Sawanarat," he said, and then bowed deeply. "I am sorry to interrupt such an important occasion, but if you will hear me out, you will understand why I had to speak with you as soon as possible. My name is Po, the humble esquire of Lord Rolando de Santa Maria del Pi of Barcelona, a great knight-errant and hero of the downtrodden. If we can speak privately, I must inform you about a great injustice which has been done, and a great injustice which is about to be done to you, madam." Now Gammon was wise beyond her years, and she knew she would earn frowns and fuel gossip if she went into some private room with this strange man who appeared at her wedding ceremony just moments before it began. "Stay right here, good sir," she said. "I will leave, and have you sent for immediately." Then she called her mother and older sister to come assist her in her fitting room. Moments later, the sister, dressed in just as fabulous a costume as her younger sibling, but in blue and red, came back into the larger chamber and invited Po back with her. I do not know exactly what was said, but it is not difficult to assume that he told her the problem, and they planned what came next. I was busy dealing with Fliang and Mr. Sawanarat, Gamon's father. When I saw Po's initial conference with Gamon seemed to be well received, I decided not to confront Fliang immediately. He hadn't yet spotted Tara in the crowd, and in her humble clothing, she blended in well with the servants bringing people drinks of sweet milky tea. When the two men came out to meet me, they were too polite to demand to know my business, or threaten to kick me out. Instead, they asked me to introduce myself, and that allowed me to buy Po some time. As you know, I can chew many minutes.
Eat up a lot of time, Search corrected.
Yes, so I dined on this time, with a particularly small fork and a very sharp knife, taking little bites of all my titles, then a salad course describing my journey, then the entree, which was a long story about my interest in seeing Bangkok and doing business in the city, with a dessert of the strong implication I was seeking to invest great sums of my family's wealth in Mr. Sawanarat's new ventures in Cambodia. I did not come out and say I was there to make inroads with Fliang as a prospective business partner, but I'm sure the men presumed that was the reason for my attendance, and they smiled and welcomed me, then excused themselves to prepare for the ceremony, which was already beginning. The portion of the traditional service in which the officiant asks the congregants if anyone knows a reason why the two people should not be wed is not universal, and it wasn't part of their ceremony. I have always found this portion of the service as strange. If a person needs to interrupt a service, they ought to do so without prompting. If no one does, this silence is uncomfortable, making people wonder if they are expected to object just to fill it with some kind of response. We did not know in advance if we would be asked if we had an objection, so we didn't wait very long. Once Gaman had processed in on her father's arm, and the older gentleman had taken his seat, the officiant, a Buddhist monk, began by welcoming us all to the beautiful ceremony, and at that recognition of the congregation, I leapt to my feet. "I apologize for the interruption," I shouted, "but I must call this wedding to a halt. The groom, Fliang, cannot legally marry Miss Sawanarat, because he is already married." There were all the gasps and looks you would expect, but Fliang kept his composure. "Nonsense," he said. "I do not know this man. He must have mistaken me for someone else." At this, Tara, who had been the mild-mannered, mourning version of herself since awakening in her village, now reverted to the monster she'd become in the jungle. With her eyes downcast, she'd been hidden behind the person sitting in front of her, but now she stood suddenly. She screamed and pulled on her hair, yanking her own head back and releasing a wordless wail which filled the hall and made many people cover their ears. We were not seated on either aisle, so Tara simply launched herself over the people in front of her, clambering like an animal as they shouted and fell to either side, until she navigated her way to the central aisle and charged at Fliang, her nails aimed at him like claws. "I do not recognize this woman," Fliang yelled, but everything in his voice betrayed the lie. When she reached him, he was able to grab her by the wrists and hold her back, but Tara found her backup weapons, forming into comprehensible words. "You told me you loved me. You deceived me. You took advantage of your position, of my naivete and my poverty, and now I am ruined. No man will marry me now. My parents will starve. You... And then she did not know what else to say, so she returned to wordless screams directed in his face. Unfortunately, despite the spell I had cast allowing us to understand and choose to speak Thai, Tara had chosen to shout at her husband in Khmer. This made sense. It was the language they communicated in, and the natural one for her to use to express her anger. But from the back of the congregation, Poe and I could hear the murmurs, and some were speculating Tara was insane. At this, Poe jumped up, then stood on his chair so he towered over everyone. "She is not mad," he shouted in Thai. "She says he married her, that he claimed he loved her, took advantage of her childishness and the power imbalance, since he owns the factory and she was a peasant who had found a job working on his factory floor." This produced a new round of gasps. Among such wealthy people, some thought Fliang's greatest crime wasn't abandoning his wife, but marrying a peasant in the first place. Poe continued to translate. "She says he has ruined her, that no man will marry her, and her parents will starve." Much to everyone's surprise, Gamon's mother and sister now rose, far more hesitantly than their words warranted. "My daughter is also ruined," Gamon's mother said. The line sounded quite rehearsed. "Yes, no man of honor will ever marry my sister now. Some will still try to marry her for my father's money, but after this scandal, her reputation is destroyed." "I will marry her," Poe cried, still standing on his chair, "and I will not accept a penny of her fortune. I seek only to bring the lovely maiden justice, and I will start by killing the man who attempted to do her dishonor, and has so dishonored his own wife." The people seated between Poe and the center aisle foresaw his need to get to the front of the room, and made a comical show as they bumped into one another, waddling quickly out of Poe's way, almost falling over one another as they spilled into the aisle. Poe muttered his thanks and made small bows as he passed them, then began striding toward Fliang. I followed behind him more slowly, pretending I needed my cane to compensate for a painful limp, and I repeated Poe's apologies to the people in the aisle and everyone I passed in a hushed voice as Poe marched ahead of me. "Of course, I might not be remembering everything word for word," Rolando admitted, "but it did seem to me that everyone involved employed formal, somewhat archaic speech patterns. Maybe they were persuaded by Tara's melancholy madness, or by Poe's diction, informed as it was by so many books of knights' great acts of chivalry. So it was a little jarring, but also refreshing, when Gamon's father, the revered and intimidating Kun Sawanarat, stood up in the aisle and blocked Poe's approach, bellowing, "What the fuck is going on here? No one is going to kill anyone. No one is getting married. This is a disaster." Though the word he used for disaster might have been better translated as clusterfuck, had the translation spell known the expression. Based on the gasps of the crowd, they heard it this way. "Everyone just get the fuck out. My deepest apologies. We'll get this all sorted somehow, and..." Gamon interrupted him and got everyone's attention before they could get out of their seats. "No, father, I must insist. If this good squire will have me and protect my honor, I will marry him right here and now, in front of all these witnesses, so everyone will know my engagement to Fliang was only broken for a few moments before I was rescued by a true gentleman." "Are you fucking kidding me?" he shouted at her. "I don't give two shits about some foreign peasant girl," he said, pointing at Tara, though the word he used for foreign was a slur which surprised everyone. "And no daughter of mine is going to marry a foreign servant of some European I've never heard of." This directed a few more eyes at me than I would have liked, but Poe pulled them away when he said, "If you will not defend your daughter's honor, what does that say about yours?" There were gasps and some oohs at this, and the temperature in the room seemed to increase a few degrees. I stepped up next to Fliang, who cringed like I might strike him. But I leaned close and whispered, "I pledge to you, I will get you out of this building alive if you do everything I say. If you do not, my esquire and your fiancé's father are going to have a fight over who gets to kill you, and whichever one wins will follow through. Listen to me and do as I say." And then I gave him very specific instructions. Meanwhile, Gorman's mother had a step between her husband and Poe, and this kept the family's bodyguards from immediately attacking my esquire. The men continued to shout at one another until Fliang got both their attention. "Kunsawanarat, I beg your forgiveness," Fliang yelled. Then he bowed stiffly and shouted at the floor. "It is true what these men say. I am married, and I abandoned my wife. I did not mean to dishonor your family, but I see that I have done so. Please, allow me to make amends. I will sell you my factory in Cambodia at a deep discount and give all the money to my wife, Tara, to do with as she pleases. I ask only that you allow your daughter, Gorman, to marry this man Poe, so that she is not dishonored by my deceit." Far more quietly than he'd been shouting before, but still clearly audible in the room, which had gone painfully still, Mr. Sawanarat said, "What kind of discount are we talking about here?" Fliang had not been given instructions from me about public negotiation, and he looked to me for help, but I raised my hands to make it clear I was not involved, then motioned for him to respond to his would-be business partner. 80% of its value? 20% off? Does that sound? "Make it 50%, Mr. Sawanarat said. Gorman made a disgusted face, but her father did not see it. Many of the guests did, though. Fliang looked at me. I shrugged. "Yes," he told Mr. Sawanarat, 50%, so that your daughter's honor may be restored, I may do right by my wife, and I might earn your forgiveness." "Fine," Mr. Sawanarat said. He turned to the assembled guests. "Let us enjoy the party and this beautiful marriage of my daughter and this squire person here." And then he turned back to Fliang, "And we will discuss the details of the sale later." The monk in his bright orange robes stood between Fliang and Gorman, just blinking, unsure what to do. Poe walked toward Fliang, who made room for him, and moved slightly behind me. I took Tara's hand and guided her over next to Fliang, but the two did not so much as look at one another. Buddhist monks take vows of poverty, but they are often paid handsome sums for performing marriages. The most ethical of them turn this over to their monasteries, and the unscrupulous dip in a bit for themselves. I do not know what kind of man this monk was, but either way, he knew who had hired him, so when Mr. Sawanarat motioned for him to continue the service, he picked up immediately where he'd left off, and gave a lovely little homily about the way the principle of compassion should be evident in a marriage, and then he made it official. Poe was now married to a woman he'd known for only minutes. As the attendees began to file out to the hall where the reception would take place, the wedding party remained to have professional photographs taken. Mr. Sawanarat leaned toward his daughter and said, "This was your choice. I hope you'll be happy with this guy." Gorman pursed her lips, closed her eyes, and took a long inhale through her nose, ruining a photograph, then affected a pleasant smile when she said, "Respectfully, fuck off, Dad. The papers will have stories about how I saved our family's honor, but everyone in here just saw you sell me for a cheap factory in Cambodia." He was taken aback. "I thought you wanted to marry this man." "I don't know anything about him," she said. "I just know this was my one and only chance to choose for myself, and I jumped at the opportunity to be free. I will send you postcards from Spain instead of Cambodia, Dad. Enjoy your new factory." And as far as I know, those were the last words she ever spoke to him, though she did write many postcards, all addressed to her mother and sister. I kept my promise to Fliang, protecting him from both Mr. Sawanarat and Poe long enough for him to get back to Cambodia and sign all the necessary paperwork to turn his factory over to his almost father-in-law and give the proceeds of the sale to Tara. He did so believing he might win her back and retained what remained of his fortune, but she divorced him and took the considerable sum back with her to her village. Tara and her parents would never want for anything ever again, and I expect she was a very attractive candidate for marriage for many men in the village, despite being a divorcee, though I do not know if she ever decided to remarry. Gorman returned with us to Barcelona. Luckily for everyone, she did fall in love with Poe, and his enchantment grew into a deep, abiding love for his wife. He continued to rise early and carry out all his duties as my esquire, but he took new quarters in my family estate."
"That's good," Serge said. "Would have been awkward if you'd made him keep sleeping at the foot of your bed."
"I concur. I don't know if Gammon was ever given the dowry which her father would have offered to a husband of his choosing, but if so, she saved it and lived simply in the house. Before her position there was ever formalized, she began helping the staff, and they admired her so much we eventually put her in charge there. She never ordered anyone around in any way that made them feel belittled, perhaps because she had always demonstrated humility, even while retaining the dignity of her status in Thailand, or perhaps because she felt she'd fallen too far in the world to lord over anyone else. The other servants did not take advantage of her kindness, but elevated themselves in an effort to please her. Poe and I continued to go on our adventures, and occasionally Gammon would travel with us as a kind of assistant to my assistant, allowing her to see much more of the world. But soon she settled in at the estate, and felt she could not leave her responsibilities behind to gallivant around the globe with us.
Then Rolando's face fell.
And here is where I made my fateful error. I made it clear to Poe that, in the name of chivalry, I could not dub him a knight, since he would never commit himself to some great lady other than his wife and seek glory in its purest form, with no expectation of love in return. Poe eagerly accepted this, desiring to continue on as my esquire, and remain married to the beautiful, gentle Gammon. But this rigid commitment of mine left him vulnerable. Because he was not a full knight-errant, I did not teach him to become a warrior mage. I taught him the way of the sword, as I am teaching you, but I did not assist him in acquiring a familiar, did not provide him with magical armor like the suit I wear, and did not teach him the offensive and defensive spells that would aid him in combat. Of course, I tried to keep him out of the fray whenever I had to do battle with a magical creature, but my choice to keep him on as a esquire put him in danger without the necessary spells to protect himself. Many years went by. I began to stretch my lifespan, as I noticed my own body aging, my reactions slowing, my healing from injury taking longer than it once had. Poe could not do these.
He looked to the raven on the center console of the car.
And much like his beloved corvids, he would eat most anything put before him, so he got a bit punchy around the middle, yes?
Poe made the ululating caw that was its laugh.
One day when Poe and I were in the Kasivari wilderness area, a mountainous region on the border between Sweden and Finland, we were overrun by a family of angry trolls. They lived in a cave high in the mountains and had been preying on human hikers who, they felt, were intruding more and more often on their territory. Poe and I attempted to explain to them that killing and eating humans would only cause more to come, searching for lost loved ones, exploring the mysterious disappearances, etc. But trolls are not very bright, and the more we tried to explain this reality, the more angry they became. I have since learned this same dynamic often occurs with humans. When people, whether they are humans or trolls or any other kind of creature, feel someone is speaking down to them, many react with anger, and some become quite petty, refusing to listen. Take, for example, people who believe vaccines will harm them instead of preventing illness which will kill them. You cannot approach such people by saying, "I am a very knowledgeable scientist. I have been studying medicine for many years at prestigious schools, and I have read scientific papers you could not even begin to comprehend, and the conclusions are clear. This vaccine is good for you." They will say, "Do not condescend to me as though you know better than I do. I will not take your vaccine, and the more you sound like a scientist, the less persuaded I will be." And this becomes a terrible spiral. The scientist says, "But I do know more than you do about this subject." This kind of person says, "Oh, so you think I am stupid?" The scientist says, "I did not call you stupid, but you are making the more ignorant choice because you will not trust someone who knows more than you do." This kind of person says, "See, you do think I am ignorant and stupid." The scientist, losing her patience, says, "Yes, you are acting stupid." And this kind of person says, "I would rather die, and I would rather let my child die, than live knowing I gave in to someone who tries to belittle me and thinks I am stupid. And when I die, it will be your fault for being so condescending to me." It is a mixture of pride and defensiveness, and it particularly afflicts those who already feel disempowered and disrespected.
Serge nodded along, then asked, "So how do you break that cycle? How do you show someone you respect them while also trying to convince them they are wrong about something?"
Rolando's eyebrows shrugged. I do not know. Once you have already become the enemy, the elite, the person they associate with all the disrespect to which they have become accustomed, I believe it is too late. Perhaps they could hear it from someone else, but not you, no matter what you say. Personally, at this point, I find it best to draw my sword and give up on verbal argument.
With anti-vaxxers? Rolando shook his head.
No, with trolls. I am no immunologist or medical professional. I do not know what they do, though I expect they wish the sword were an option at times. In this instance in Finland, for we were just on the eastern side of the border, I argued for too long. As I said, this only makes people more angry. When they decided to attack us, it turned out there were far more trolls living in their cave than we expected. Poe did not have time to get to a safe distance, and the furious trolls would not respect the honorable rules of engagement and limit themselves to doing battle with me alone. A troll's weapons of choice are his club and his teeth, and Poe had slowed as he approached middle age, and was looking like the more satisfying meal. As I fought off a group of them with my sword and fireballs and lightning, protected by my magical armor and shield spell, my faithful esquire was beset by many trolls, who broke his bones and gnawed on his flesh. The injuries Poe sustained were too extensive to be repaired, even by my greater healing potions, and our location was far too remote to get him to human doctors or magical sources of healing. So there, high in the mountains above Lake Pitsusjärvi, my loyal esquire died. After I slew all the troll warriors and frightened the rest deep into their cave, I used the last of my strength and the full extent of my magic to carry his body down the mountain, so it could be returned to Barcelona for burial. Gammon was too kind to ever say so directly, but I believe she blamed me for Poe's death, Rolando said. The raven pecked gently at Rolando's shoulder, then rubbed its ghostly, skull-less head against him. Perhaps she did not. I blamed myself, and it is possible that she could not bear the weight of my self-recrimination in addition to her own grief. She did not feel she could return to her family in Thailand, but she also could not remain in Spain, so she left. I tried to stay in touch with her, and we exchanged some letters and her famous postcards, but eventually I lost track of her, and my letters returned unopened.
His face brightened somewhat.
But this brings me to the part of the story you must learn. A few years later, in a battle with a lich in French Guiana, my familiar, Paula, was killed. Yes, even a ghost can be killed. Or re-killed. She bravely sacrificed herself, knowing the lich had the power to dissipate specters of all kinds, providing me the opportunity to use a reflection spell, which sent the very same ghost-destroying magic back at him, killing him. Or re-killing him. Of course, as a lich, he'd killed himself the first time in order to gain his undead powers, and he sort of killed himself the second time, since it was his own spell which I redirected back at him, so he re-suicided, I suppose, but involuntarily the second time. Finding myself without a familiar, and still grieving the loss of my dear Poe, I decided to see if his soul was at rest, or if he would be available to serve in this new role. There is a ritual which I will teach you, which calls a familiar to your service, but it only works on a spirit who remains in this world. I gathered all the ingredients to perform the ritual, and then I snuck into the cemetery in Barcelona where Poe's body had been buried. The first part of the ritual discovers spirits. People have been dying in Barcelona for well over 2,000 years. Much of the city now sits atop an ancient Roman necropolis, and Roman tombs are still being discovered as new construction projects dig deeper foundations. But there are not many spirits which remain there. People die, and they go on to whatever is beyond the reach of magic, even beyond the knowledge of magic. There may be a heaven or a hell or something else, I do not know. It's like your Shakespeare wrote, an undiscovered country.
Serge shook his head in surprise. Ours? Nah, we may pretend Jesus was American because admitting he was a Palestinian Jew is uncomfortable for every American right now, but we leave Shakespeare to the Brits. He cocked his head to the side. Their big Ferris wheel, and the clock, and the police without guns, and a vestigial royal family, and making politicians answer hard questions, and Shakespeare. That's about it. We pretty much try to take everything else. Like The Office. And Patrick Stewart and Benedict Cumberbatch, I think of them as American. But not Judi Dench. She'll always be like Shakespeare to me. Rolando seemed a bit irritated by this interruption.
Yes, well, when people die, spirits do not go to the United Kingdom, or to this cursed nation, but to some other place I cannot explore. Only some do not go immediately. They linger for various reasons. So I cast my first spell in the ritual, and, just as had occurred when I discovered Paula, the woman who liked men's posteriors, I saw the glow over a single grave in the whole cemetery, and it was the resting place of the bones of my dear friend Poe. Then I cast the second spell at his grave, calling that glowing spirit up. I could not yet speak with him, could not ask him if I had his permission to disturb him. The entire process is quite like enslavement, and I could only promise myself that if he did not wish to continue in my service, I would release him. Many wizards do not do this. They keep their familiars against their will and force the spirits to serve them. Some claim this tension, the subservience of a reluctant spirit, produces even more powerful magic. But that feels icky to me.
Icky, Serge said.
Yes, disgusting. But I had to cast my third spell before I could know. I had brought the bones of the animal I would send Poe's spirit into, minus the skull, which I would retain to command him and direct his magical power. When I sent his spirit into those bones, Poe became the raven you now see. And once I could speak with it, the raven told me it desired to remain in my service, just as Poe had in his mortal life. Even better, it told me Poe did not blame me for his demise. I still felt responsible, but I cannot tell you how much it soothed my heart to know my dear friend Poe did not share my opinion.
Rolando sat back heavily in the passenger seat and rested a hand gently on the back of the raven's missing head and tops of his skeletal wings. He could not truly pet the bird, only hold his hand slightly above the space where he estimated the ghostly form came to an end. But Poe could make itself solid, and the raven did so, pressing up into its master's palm. Still looking at Poe, Rolando continued to speak to Serge. So this is what we must do for you. I will not make the same mistake twice. When you decide you are ready, even if you are not committed to remain in the service of the Lady Ariel Honan for all time, even if you may someday take a human wife, even though you are not fully trained as a knight-errant, I will help you acquire a familiar, and I will begin teaching you how to use magic. Perhaps this is a betrayal of my own vows. It could be some other knight-errant would judge it as such and feel obligated to challenge me to a duel and destroy me for teaching magic to someone who has not committed his life to the code. If so, I would not defend myself, but surrender to such a judgment, because I do not know if I am doing the correct thing. But I cannot leave you unprotected, as I did with my friend Poe. There will be bloody and glorious battle before our quest is complete. Maybe with the swine men, maybe with others. But I will see to it you have all the armor I can give you before such a fight. For Poe I will do this, and for his wife, Gamon, and for my own restless soul. If you're excited about this project, please subscribe on YouTube or like and share on TikTok or Reels or whatever app you're on now. And if you're willing to support me as I craft this novel in serial form, please consider supporting my Substack or Patreon. Each week I'll give a shout out to those patrons, but there weren't any new ones this week, so please tell a friend about the show, especially if they have something they'd like me to plug, so I have more people to thank next week. If any of you listeners are creators and have something to plug, please email NotAPipePublishing at NotAPipePublishing@gmail.com. See you back here next week for Chapter 19 of Tilting at Windmills. Teaser: Serge gets a familiar, and I think you're going to love it.
This directed a few more eyes at me than I would have liked.